Ahoy! I am back and we have a new patch for the PTR today, which is actually very important. It's one of the later patches and introduces the Springtide Bloom event, which in itself is just a small event, but it comes with some very important balance changes, as well as some changes outside of the patch itself that we need to talk about, also concerning weapon balance. The patch notes start out here by explaining the Springtide Bloom event. We'll look into that in detail tomorrow. I found some secrets about that you may be interested in. We'll continue with the more general changes. One of the noteworthy ones here is any defeated Varangians in the Empyrean Forge expedition will now count towards the player's Season Pass progression. That is pretty important because that is where most of the Varangians are and you have to kill a lot of Varangians for the Season Pass quests. The Season Journey rewards for Chapter 4 and 5 are swapped, which means you can now get the plus 5% XP or Season Pass XP trophy on Chapter 4, which makes a lot more sense because you're not getting it at the end of having finished most of the pass, essentially. The final boss in the Empyrean Forge had a spot where players could be damage immune that is fixed. The mutation fix that I thought was already posted on live has been introduced again, where elemental mutations are now switching properly and you're not getting the same one repeatedly. The order of mutations will automatically change as well because of a new expedition being introduced and us having an uneven number again, so you're not going to have the same 2 expeditions every week as well. And now for an absolutely massive change. You can also see it in the gameplay right here. I don't know why it's labeled under World AI, but updated the 300 con attribute bonus to specify melee basic attacks, makes sense, and added grid to Void Blade basic attacks while at 300 con. Let's talk about that for a moment, because that is actually huge. Once upon a time, I used to play in Wars and I used to play Void Gauntlet, or Void Blade rather, along with Ice Gauntlet or other utility offense. I ran Great Axe for a while for an extra graph well as well and for the escape from that, and all kinds of other fancy stuff that didn't really work out. I can't recommend some of it, like I wouldn't do Void Gauntlet Spear again, but I had to try it, and I was a huge fan of the Void Gauntlet, even though it definitely has its shortcomings. And one of the big issues that especially the Void Blade had was the lack of grid, when every other melee weapon at the time had grid through the 300 strength perk. Now this didn't entirely prevent you from Void Blading in that sense. It was still a useful perk by itself, but it was something that made it a lot more annoying to use, especially when this was a time when there were also a lot of path being used pretty much all the time. So if you got into a clump, you would get staggered a lot, and if you got a basic of, what to say, 50-50 chance basically. Now having grid on the Void Blade is massive in that regard and completely changes the viability of Void Blade in Wars, which kinda got pushed out in favor of just using Orb, which makes a lot more sense because you just quickly throw all your abilities out, you still get a decent amount of rend, a decent amount of quick damage into a clump, and then you just switch to another weapon, and that is also more possible with offense, like Blunderbuss being a thing now, using that for damage instead. But now Void Blade itself can be used, which comes with advantages when it comes to ability activation, cooldown reduction and so on for the Void Gauntlet specifically, so there are definitely perks to having that. The downside here is, or the issue that still exists, is that the Void Blade tracking itself is not in a good state. There was a change at some point that actually made it worse. It used to not be as bad as it is now. It was never great because the second swing just has really weird tracking compared to all other melee weapons, but now it feels worse than it used to, and it's really frequent that you will see ghosting on this weapon. So I believe that there's still work to be done for this to feel fully viable and effective compared to other melee weapons. There's definitely room to consider it now, which I think is very interesting. Now obviously the meta is going to drastically change with, for example, Fortify and not being as important anymore and Rend not being as important, and these being fundamental things for the Void Gauntlet or the Void Blade, especially at the moment. There are multiple Fortifies in the tree that you can utilize, and there's the Rend from the Void Blade itself. All of that is going to be less effective, so the question really will be if the Void Blade can remain effective, especially at 300 con as well. But if it can do that, I would love to see a bit of a comeback of that, with maybe different offense from back then, but I think it would definitely be cool to see. I don't think it is something that would entirely take over the meta, especially because it is something that requires 300 con, so your damage isn't going to be particularly high with this build. That is just part of what it is. And Void Blading has always been a little bit dull by itself as well, so I know a lot of players don't want to play it, but having it as a more viable niche would definitely be appreciated. But the Void Gauntlet is not the only weapon that gets an update. The Blunderbuss gets a fix to his Blast Shot tooltip, which didn't describe rend accurately and now explains that it reduces armor now. For the Greatsword, there was an issue where Adaptive Rush upgrade for the Relentless Rush would cause the applied root to prevent dodges entirely while rooted, and this is now fixed. Along with that, there is another change that should actually be a separate point, that's just not formatted properly here. Fixed an issue where the hitbox size of Calamity Counter ability was bigger than intended and extended past the visuals of the attack. This is actually something that you could utilize in a chasing situation, which is very weird when you think about how that ability is meant to work. Basically, if you run after someone and instantly cancel this ability after using it, it would kind of track onto them a little bit and swing forward. And yeah, I'm assuming that is what they're talking about. I'm assuming that is what will be fixed with this, which makes the whole ability itself a little less usable, and I already think it's not exactly the strongest ability on the Greatsword and only really used by very defensive playstyles where it's used in place of a Rapier. Most other players are kind of staying away from Calamity Counter, even with a lot of the more tanky builds. So I don't know if it needs a nerf like that, but maybe it'll be more interesting or more eyes on it now that it's one of the abilities that hasn't been nerfed as much, considering how hard some of the others have been hit. So who knows, maybe this is why they're preemptively nerfing it as well. The Spear's Impactful Strikes perk on Perforate, the new perk that applies Weaken to the target with each hit up to 30%, would apply from other spear hits as well, and that has now fortunately been fixed. I also have some fixes here to the Sundering Javelin perk, not listing the conditions triggered, as well as the Fortifying Burnout perk, not working consistently with other fortifies. The NCAP seasonal quest now includes some furniture schematic rewards as well. Very cool for furnishing people like me. And there was an incorrect amount of expedition resources on the expedition rewards track chest. The season pass level 100 premium reward, which was previously empty, will now provide the Tattered Varangian standard housing item. And now we have a very important change to something that I already talked about. They were planning on making it so that you can upgrade a variety of different items with Umbral shards, after that initially basically being a mistake, something that they didn't want in the patch, and then the community feedback was, we want this though, and then they said, okay, we put it in the patch, but we have to do certain things, we can't do all of it, and it looks like they can't actually do all of the things that they wanted to do after that. So, items that can be upgraded to 600 gear score and get an additional perk now are items from Outpost Rush, and this now includes weapons as well as armor. But along with that, you also can get this from war item rewards, so weapons, trinkets, and armor, and invasion rewards, same thing there, and OPR items, again, the Conqueror's weapons and the Rusher's armor and trinkets. The only items that are excluded here are shields, because they cannot be legendary, is what they said. They actually can be legendary, you just have to own it already, one of the old ones, when they could roll legendary. It is worth keeping in mind that the Umbral upgrade costs are being changed on this PTR as well. Zeladin has looked into that, so it seems that it would be a bit more expensive to consistently upgrade things to 600 in order to see if they are good rewards. And as a little addition here, Zinramu also specifically talked about these changes, saying unfortunately we're not going to get upgrading for gypsum casts or breaches in season 1, which is weird because they kind of said it was already on breaches, so that one confused me, but hey. They said they hit some technical difficulties here, no plans yet on when or if that will happen, so maybe we'll never actually get that. I really hope they can get around to doing that for the gypsum cast items. Also for a bunch of fixes, first a batch of visual fixes here primarily, and then a leaderboard fix. Musket traps and other spawned objects will no longer count towards the kill leaderboards for war and 33 arenas. I did not know this was the case, but this kind of explains a lot in terms of how some people had such high stats. There's also an important trading change. Ragnarforge pointed out that if you don't have furnishing level to 200, you can't farm all the mats for the human combat trophies, because you need flame cores, and flame cores are bound to the player, so you can't trade them to somebody else for them to craft it for you. so they would have to found the flame cores, which would make the trophies very, very expensive, because who would want to spend a ton of flame cores for somebody else unless they make a lot of money from it? So they said that that's not a good idea, and Chartis actually responded saying, "Thank you for the call out. This was an oversight on our end, and we'll make sure flame cores are tradable like other resources." I think this will be a very important change and also an interesting way to make money next patch, because flame cores will drop especially from the new expedition, and some people will probably farm a lot from there. And then there are also other ways to get them, which people will probably dedicate themselves to in order to sell these cores, especially in the beginning. So this is definitely going to be a very interesting change for the economy. But there's also another significant PvP change. Zin Ramu responded to a thread about the Rapier. The goal of these stagger changes was twofold. One, to identify a move as either a CC move or a damage move. And if it's a CC move, to make sure the damage is low or moderate. If it's a damage move, to remove the CC. And also, second, more clearly differentiate which weapons had CC and staggers to differentiate weapons better. In reviewing our decisions, I do think the removal of the stagger on all Flourish and Finish was overly aggressive because it hurt the ability as a whole. We're reviewing this and will likely add the stagger back to the first part with a slight reduction in damage to that part before Season 1 goes live. Now, I will say this, I am not a big fan of that for two reasons. On one hand, I don't think the Rapier itself needs more defensive capabilities, and the stagger is a not so insignificant defensive capability that many people tend to just underrate in PvP for defensive purposes. And on the other hand, I don't like them reducing the damage on Flourish and Finish from a PvE perspective. I think that it makes kind of sense with where we're heading in the PvE meta, but I do think that Flourish and Finish being a strong damaging PvE tool is cool. And I'd rather have it deal high damage and not stagger than have it stagger and deal less damage. I completely understand that anyone who uses the Rapier defensively will likely see this very differently, but I do think that it needs to be said, especially for the PvE side of things here. Of course, Zinramu only said that is a slight reduction in damage here, so we'll see how much it actually ends up being and how much of a stagger the ability will also get back in return. So nothing set in stone here, but I personally hope that they maybe just stick to the damage side of things. But we still have to talk about the secrets of the Springtide Bloom event. And that is what we're going to do tomorrow. So if you'd like to see that, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified when that comes out. If you want early trading tips or just to chat with me on Discord, you can join the Patreon, which I'll link right here. So thanks to my patrons for supporting me, and thank you for watching. SLOTH out.